Hi guys, welcome to another installment of Jan's Opening Clinic. I'm Jan and this is the show where I do my very best to answer Chess24 users' opening questions in like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes per question. So it's not gonna be a lecture on every topic, but I'm trying to give my truthful opinion and hopefully help once in a while. Or if not help, then at least mock. I'm sometimes a bit worried to give away all my secrets, or even worse, the secrets of Team Carlsen. But so far, I think we've been relatively safe, because no one's really watching this show. Still, we do have a couple questions to get to, and without further ado, let's jump into them. ViciousSeal is wondering, hi Jan. I'm playing the English Opening quite a bit, and I'm getting one variation quite often, in that I always feel like it's so hard to create anything. c4, c6, to g3, knight to f6, bishop g2, d5, bishop f3, knight f3, bishop f5, and so on and so forth. I'll put it on the board in a second. Some endgame. Or do you feel that in the rising position is anything white can do to pose problems for black? In practice, I could only win this position if black actually tried to win, which would rarely happen if they went for this position. For repertoire reasons, I think I can only improve up from move 3, since I would play g3 after c4, knight f6. Alright, let's have a look. So he's talking about c4, c6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, d5. First of all, I understand you just said this is your repertoire. I'll centralize a bit. But I do think that you limit yourself a little bit by meeting c6 setups with g3 exclusively, or even knight f6 with always g3. Because of c6, d5. Sort of a block against your bishop. I understand these lines aren't so silly, but just in general, I have a feeling that's maybe restricting yourself a bit too much. Still, let's look at the line you mentioned. Knight f6, bishop g2, d5, knight f3. In this position, black has quite a few choices. I still consider d takes c4 the main move here. Bishop g4, probably second place. And bishop f5, as mentioned by ViciousSeal. In third, this bishop on f5 I never like that much. Sometimes if white puts a pawn on d3, can appear to be a little shut out of the action there. It's often a target to knight h4s or knight d4s, so while I understand it's a legit move, it wouldn't be that high on my list. Queen b3, queen b6, d3 is one of the main lines here. e6, bishop e3, takes. Pawn to a6, keeping a7. And I do agree that it looks very solid for black, but there are some light squares that would worry me a little bit here. And for me, as a bishop fan, I'm a bit surprised that you don't like this position, because you can grab this bishop by going knight to h4. Not the only move. We've had some high-level games. I think Pirc played something very cryptic here, some bishop d2, bishop c3 maybe. And bishop d4 is also indicated by the computer, going after these dark squares. But I find it too tempting to try to grab that bishop. And as far as I can see, it's a fairly decent position for white. So not sure what bothered you here. I guess the main move is bishop back to g6. Bishop g4 doesn't really help because we can chase it down by playing h3, g4. Something like, I don't know, bishop b4 check. I don't see how it improves the black position after knight to c3. So bishop g6 makes sense to me. Then I like the move f4, sort of keeping your options open when you want to take this guy. Or if maybe you want to go h3, g4, knight c3 and f5. And yeah, as I said, I sort of prefer white. There's not many games here. I found one game, I believe it was Morozevich-Bologan or Bologan-Morozevich? No, Morozevich-Bologan 2015. Where this check was given, but white just played king to d1. Not forced, but reasonable. The king is pretty safe here. Short castles. Now knight d2 was played. My computer says if you go knight to c3 here or king c2, keeping some more pressure on the center, then white is better. and I see no reason to argue with that assessment. So, long story short, I like that position for white, and I'd be happy after knight h4. Maybe I'm missing some very deep positional idea, but to me it looks like white is better there. And I would not be too concerned about that line. Probably be more concerned about the DC4s of the world. Thank you for your question. I'm struggling with verbal cadence more than usual today. Mr. ViciousSeal. Let's get to Mr. Tribal. I hope that's how it's pronounced. He's saying, hi Jan, what is the best way for white to fight for an advantage in the mainline Pirc after e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, f4, and so on and so forth. The Austrian attack, sharp line. And now after both king f8 or king d7, or is it better to deviate earlier? We shall see. So the Austrian attack. 3f4, always one of the main lines in the Pirc. I think recently most white players have started preferring setups with like bishop e3 followed by h3 or even knight f3, queen d2, turning bishop h6, and this f4 has gone slightly out of fashion, but these things could change. I'm not sure if they have concluded that these lines are no longer promising or if it's a fashion thing. So c5, I always consider this the main move as well. Castles bishop d3. I kind of like for white. c5, d takes c, queen to... Ah no, sorry, not d takes c. Bishop b5 check was the line you mentioned. Even though I've always had some sympathy for d takes c, queen a5. And now there's some weirdo moves the computer gives, like queen to d4 or queen to d3. So if you're looking for an offbeat alternative, you could study these things as well. But bishop b5 check, bishop to d7, pawn to e5, knight to g4. This is a line that I learned quite early in my chess upbringing. I believe because this line after e6 gives you the option to go for a very picturesque move repetition that we have seen played many a time. Black sacrificed the queen, but miraculously has perpetual check here. And that's a bit of a problem when you're analyzing this line, because like 60% of the games will end in this sequence, prearranged or not, but I'm not sure how much we can trust it. So I had to, later on when I was looking at it, sort of try to figure out what's going on here, while ignoring all these perpetuals. First of all, I know you asked about bishop takes b5, but I think f takes e6 is actually not a bad move. Knight g5, bishop takes b5, knight e6, bishop takes d4. And the way for white to continue the game is to play knight takes b5, black goes queen a5 check. This is somehow reasonably forced. Queen to d2, queen takes, bishop takes, king to d7. If white wants to play for an advantage here, he should grab this rook. But after knight ec7, the line goes a6, takes a4 to free the knight. B takes a, knight b6, king c6, knight takes a4. We get some strange endgame where black has an exchange down, has a pawn and decent pieces for it. And I'm not sure what the correct evaluation of this position is. I'm guessing it's somewhere between slightly better for white and equal, but it does not strike me as a hopeless position for black at all. So f takes e6, also a move you have to keep in mind when I think white has to go for this endgame. So be ready for that. Anyway, now we finally made it to your question. Bishop takes b5, e takes f7 check, and now either king to f8 or king to d7. I checked both moves more or less equally popular, both in practical play and in correspondence play. So not clear which is better, and also not clear if black has clean equality after either. Let's start with king d7, knight takes b5, queen a5 check, knight c3, cd, knight d4. And here there's a bit of a crossroads, there's a bunch of options, but none that I found too satisfying. Like bishop d4, queen d4, knight c6, let's say queen c4, just looks nice for white. So I think they typically play h5, defending the knight, and white, yeah, has a bunch of options. h3 looks like a very plausible move. Short castle is also legal. But let's say h3, knight c6, knight e2, Compy is happy. Compy is normally happy for white in these positions, but he's happy even here. Although our structure is not great, he's arguing. Your king is weak. And hard to argue too much with him. So I think after king d7, white should be somewhat better. King f8 is the move played by, amongst others, world champion Magnus Carlsen. So probably that should be our main line. Check, knight c3, cd4, knight d4. And Carlsen took on f7 here. Had a game against Nakamura, where Nakamura played queen takes g4, and Carlsen more or less equalized. My computer likes this move, knight to f3, which looks strange, allowing bishop takes c3. But it appears that, first of all, getting out of the way on d4 and then setting up this idea of knight g5 check is somewhat annoying for black. Let's say h6 castles. Compy is happy for white. Bishop takes c3, b takes c would be my first instinct. Now something like knight f6. But once again, Comp says knight g5 check. White is better. So I could not find clean equality here. I also looked at knight c6. Then, once again, different options, but this seemed like the way to go. It seems like white is always somewhat better in these positions because his king is a little safer than the black king. And frankly, I was surprised that not more people go for this line with white. I'm not a big specialist and maybe I'm missing some established way to equality, but I could not really see it. And yeah, it was a bit puzzling. My best guess is that not everybody likes this position after fe, but I'm really not sure. So I would say go for it and see if people manage to show you how to equalize. The problem is maybe practically that black has a bunch of different options, but it doesn't look too bad. All the alternatives, I'm guessing you know this, involve like taking on d7 here, queen d7, d5, d takes c, h3, which are also far analyzed these days. e4, either knight takes e4, knight to f6, or hg, ef, queen f3. I think consensus is black equalizes if he knows exactly what he's doing, but if he doesn't, he could get under quite some pressure. So those are decent practical chances as well. But yeah, I think the way you suggested makes a lot of sense, and I'm not quite sure why we don't see it more often. Thanks, Mr. Tribal, or T3B1L. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Let's get to the next question. Krunx wonders, I'm following your video series on Nimzo Queen C2. I have a question regarding this line. D4 E6, C4 knight F6. Why start with 1 E6 Krunx? What is the meaning behind that? Anyway, D4 E6, C4 knight F6. Knight C3, bishop B4, Queen C2 castles, knight F3, D5. CD, queen takes D5. How do I punish black for taking with the queen? Now when I saw this question, my first thought was, this looks stupid. After c takes d5, everybody will play e takes d5, and I still think so, but I was surprised to find out that queen takes d5 is not as bad as I thought. Because the obvious theoretical comparison that came to my mind is after queen c2, instead of castles, there is this line d5, cd, queen d5 now, and if white goes knight f3, black plays queen f5. This is sort of the big point of the line. While if you were to castle here, we will reach the position you mentioned, which I never looked at. I just assumed this has to be good for white. But things aren't that simple. I spent some time looking at it, and in the end I could not find anything better than bishop to d2, followed by e3, or e3 followed by bishop d2. Seem to be coming down to the same thing. Bishop d2 takes, bishop takes. White has the two bishops, but in typical Nimzo fashion, black is fighting for the light squares here in the center, which, yeah, gives him a bit of a chance to equalize. Still, I would prefer white. There's two moves here that I looked at. Knight to e5 looks tempting, intending to go f3 followed by e4, or just f3 really, controlling this crucial e4 square. And that strikes me as a very sensible option. I thought black should probably play knight e4, try to get that bishop as long as there's time. And after e3, knight takes c3. Both queen takes and pawn takes. I have the feeling white should have a bit of a pull. It's not exactly a world beater, but I thought this has to be a playable position after both queen takes or pawn takes. What I would do probably though instead of knight to e5 is just develop. Go e3, bishop to b7, bishop to e2. I assume knight bd7, short castles. Not sure what black wants here, and I'll probably prepare c5, c5 directly. Looks a bit premature after rook ft1 or d takes c. And if knight to e4 here, I think we can ignore playing rook ft1, maybe hinting at bishop to e1. And if knight takes c3, bc, once again, white is somewhat better because of his powerful center. So yeah, what did I look at? Some rook ac8, I think, instead of knight e4, rook ft1. Some like queen f5. White is a little better. It's not that much, and yeah, I was surprised to find out that this queen takes d5 is actually a playable move. But that's the best I can offer. Just bishop d2, recapture, play e3, bishop e2, and enjoy your little advantage. I was surprised though. I thought it would be possible to punish this more brutally, but did not manage to. Anyway, thanks for pointing that out. I hope I helped you a little bit, Mr. Krunx. Next in line we have... who's that? Maac? He's saying, "Hi Jan, I wish some advice for black about what is... so it is slightly better. About what is... better in the Chebanenko line, d4, d5, c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, a6, c5. Bishop f5 or knight bd7. Knight bd7 seems to be more rich dynamically, based in a future e5 for black, and bishop f5 more solid and simple perhaps. In the bishop f5 line, queen b3, queen c8, is queen b3, queen c8 reliable, rook a7 he doesn't like. Sergei Volkov is a specialist in the knight b7 line, but I see many defeats for him with black. Alright, so let's have a look at the Chebanenko Slav that Maac is talking about, which, yeah, is represented by the move a6 here instead of d takes c4, the classical Slav, or e6, the semi-Slav. Black plays the little move a6, a useful waiting move, taking control of the b5 square and telling white, please show your hand. White has many options. I myself have played cd, a4, e3, queen c2, to name a few in this position. And c5, in a way, is the most principled, saying, haha, you weakened the b6 square. I will fix that weakness instantly. The problem, of course, is that white gives up pressure on the center and closes the position. So nothing's for free. But c5 has been, and probably will be for quite a while, one of the most challenging main moves here. To answer your question, I'm not sure. I'm not a fan of either line here for black. So let's look at the issues. If you go bishop f5, this I think has always been considered to be the less ambitious but more solid move. Black, I believe, is okay if white plays slowly. Let's say stuff like this. Don't quote me on individual moves here, but overall I had the feeling these positions were fine for black. Let's say castles, castles. And you go knight e4, a typical plan is also queen c8, rook e8, bishop d8, bishop c7. So it seemed like with slow play, the black position can't really get hurt very much, which is why people started coming up with this more direct move, queen to b3. You mentioned you don't like rook a7, which I understand. I would argue queen c8 is just as ugly as rook a7, but I get your point. Once again, if white plays slowly, I think black is okay. The same idea, bishop f4, knight b7, e6, bishop e7. So what people have started to do here is to play knight to h4, trying to create some disharmony in the black camp. Is that a word? Disharmony? Some chaos, some panic in the black ranks. ASAP. Black doesn't have a great square for the bishop. Bishop g6 allows white to take it at his convenience, similarly to this c4, c6, g3 line we looked earlier, and I think white should just be a bit better there. People have experimented with e6 or g6, but it looks pretty bad for black, so I don't believe in either of those. The most logical move to my mind is bishop back to e6. And here, yeah, we had some recent games with something like e3, g6. I guess this is the position to explore. Bishop d3, white wants the castle, go f4. And it looks quite tempting for white to me. I could not really see how black reacted. But still, I feel this is the critical line that you want to check more closely if you want to go for this. Because other options after knight h4 did not convince me. Like bishop g6. Even if white plays some weird stuff like this. With this guy not running away, it's always going to be a bit tricky. Yeah, probably not a4, not even best f3. Many options, so I didn't like it. Bishop e6 is what I will play here, but it looked like the ball was in black's court. Let's get to the alternative, which is knight bd7, bishop f4. Here, I think it's been established that if white gets h3, e3, he's somewhat better. So black tries to bother this bishop immediately with knight to h5. Like 10-15 years ago, we had all these theory debates around e3, which I think have been settled. Black is fine after e3, and white started keeping his bishop by going bishop back to d2 here, which poses more problems. Black doesn't have anything better, as far as I can tell, than returning with a knight to f6, because if not, white might go e2 to e4. And after knight f6, white nowadays typically chooses between rook c1 and queen to c2. And both, as far as I can tell, lead to somewhat more pleasant positions for white. Queen c2, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, castles is a typical continuation. Now black plays b6, at least I saw some games by Malachov, I believe, with the black pieces who played b6 here and was defending this position, which I would guess is slightly better for white. Rook a1, turning queen c1, maybe bishop h6 as an example, but not the end of the world for black. But yeah, nothing I would be too eager to play with black. Same can be said about rook c1. The lines are sort of similar. Both sides fianchetto their bishop. Here black probably shouldn't play b6 because his rook is waiting for it. Instead, you go rook e8 and you hint at ideas involving e5 or knight e4 followed by e5. Well, once again, I'd take white, but the black position isn't too bad. So to sum up, I don't have great news for you. I like white's chances currently after both lines. If I had to choose, I would probably play bishop f5 after queen b3. Either give rook a7, which I know you didn't like, another look, or try to make this line work for black. But currently, it seems like black is under some pressure in both. Maybe you might want to look long term for an alternative to the Chebanenko as well. Thank you for your question, Mr. Mark. Next in line we have our friend chessbeauty, women FIDE master. She's saying, "Hi Jan sir, I have a question regarding the Sicilian. e4, c5, c3, knight to f6, pawn to e5, knight d5, and so on. I'll put it on the board in a second. I have been having some trouble in this line lately, and I feel black is fine after the endgame arising from knight f3, queen e6. Could you please suggest an alternative line in which white gets a playable middle game? Thanks." I will try. I should first point out that the move to c3 is not forced. You could play knight f3 followed by d4 or bishop b5, which probably, at least long term, will give you better chances for a playable middle game. I understand you're aware of this, and c3 is a nice time saver and all that. But the problem, if you keep sticking to the sidelines, is that these issues with getting playable middle games will pile up, because black has a bunch of decent lines, as far as I know. So knight f6, e5, knight d5, knight to f3, pawn to d6. I normally play knight c6 or e6 here, so not exactly a specialist. But after d6, I assume d4 is the main alternative. And chessbeauty asks about the move bishop to c4, targeting the knight. And now knight to b6. Once again, not a specialist, not sure what happens after d takes e5. e6 will transpose to lines that I sometimes play with black. So knight to b6. And first of all, yeah, I checked your line. I think I agree with the assessment. Looks alright for black after bishop b3, c4. Bishop c2 takes queen d5. Queen e2, f6, knight f3, queen e6. It does seem like we're headed for an equal endgame. b3 takes e5, stuff like this. So yeah, hard to deviate after you play bishop b3. Therefore, the best I could see, and I'm not sure how much I like it, but at least the best I could see, is to play this strange looking move e5 to e6 here. F takes e6 seems to be pleasant for white. Now you go bishop b3. And this is a very different situation where the black king side has been weakened. This pawn on e6 really doesn't help development. So black should have problems long term. Well, white has easy play. Castles, knight g5, b3, d3. This looks like pretty good compensation. Of course, you could check it a bit further, but I did like white's chances here. The critical move is white takes c4. Now we go for this more or less forced sequence. Check, knight c6, check, check. Queen takes c4. Well, in practice, they have mainly been playing d5, queen f4 check, king to g8, d4. And yeah, it's a very unbalanced position. Black has good long-term prospects with the two bishops, but he also does have this rook locked out on h8 and will take quite a while to coordinate and get going. So I do think this qualifies as a playable middle game. I'm not sure I can promise an edge here, but it does strike me as playable after e6. Both queen g3, which was once played by, I think, Tkachyev, anticipating bishop d6, bishop f4, or the more standard castles, bishop d6, queen e3, leads to, yeah, sharp positions, strategically sharp positions, where both sides have their trumps. I would guess it's roughly equal, but I would think that it's very playable for white, especially because you will probably have an edge in knowledge if you decide to go for these lines, because who has the time to check such things with black in detail? An alternative could be e6 to d5, but that feels somewhat more clumsy, and white goes d4. Guess it's better. So yeah, as mentioned, I think long-term the Alapin, you will keep running into these problems. Short-term, the best fix I could see in your line with bishop c4, if you don't like d4 here, is to try e5 to e6. That's hard to promise an advantage in that one as well. Thanks for the question, Chess Beauty. Then we have the old bum. He's saying, hello, Jan. What would you play in this position as white? Knight f3, b6, d4, bishop b7, c4, e6. I tried my usual 4a3, but a guy played 4f5. Is there some other good move you'd try after knight f3, b6? And he says, it was good to see you back in action. My feeling is that Anish and Alex didn't make enough snide jokes about Hearthstone. Thank you. Yeah. You can count on the Hearthstone jokes. Not sure you can count on sound opening or other chess advice, but I will continue giving Peter a hard time for his hobbies. Anyway, let's have a look at knight to f3, b6. First of all, in such a position, if black dares you to play 2e4, I would normally say, just go e4, punish them. Bishop b7, knight c3. And here black could either go knight f6, e5, knight d5. I guess you take and play d4. It should be somewhat better for white. Bishop comes out. Or they play e6. When there was this high-profile game, I think Elyanov against Carlsen, where Carlsen, in order to get an unbalanced position, went for knight f3, b6. And Elyanov, being a principal player, went for this. I think, yeah, they played the most sensible moves for quite a while and got this position, which I guess is slightly better for white. We do have the two bishops, and it's somewhat similar to this Nimzo line I talked about earlier, in that, yeah, black has given up the two bishops, has some central control, but not that much. I forgot how Ilyanov played here. I guess he played c4, a4 is also a move given by the computer. That seems to lead to a slightly better position for white. So that's one option if you want to be super principled. And guys, go knight f3, b6. However, your question was d4, bishop b7, c4, e6. What to play here? I'm not sure. If given this position, I guess I would also play a3. As mentioned, I probably wouldn't get it. I guess I would choose between a3 and g3. g3 is not a bad move. It's very solid for white. There is this line, which Giri played in the last round of the Chess Olympiad, that leads to somewhat unbalanced looking structure. But if you check it a bit, it turns out that white is still extremely solid here, f4, intending knight to c3. And there's really not that much to fear. The white structure controls enough pawns. And if anybody's better, it is probably white here, even though black is reasonably solid. So I guess it would depend on your repertoire. G3, of course you have to be ready to transpose to this Queen's Indian main line after knight f6, bishop g2. Yeah, you mentioned a3, and you mentioned you didn't like it because of f5. Black weakening his king position with f5 should never discourage you from playing a move like a3. I'm only half tongue-in-cheek. This is a reasonably playable position that we normally get via different, like d4, e6, c4, b6, a3, bishop b7, knight c3, f5, d5, knight f6. And I guess here white normally would not start with knight to f3, but go g3, bishop g2 first and keep this knight flexible. However, that does not feel like too big a concession to me. So even in your move order, with knight f3, b6, d4, bishop b7, c4, e6, a3, f5, d5, I think white should be somewhat better, and it should be very playable. Of course, this type of position has been seen many times, and black has tried different things. They try a5 followed by knight a6, they direct knight a6 or bishop d6, intending to sometimes go e5 here. But generally, if you just play this and you go g3, bishop g2, I do believe that white is slightly better, and it's not a position, or not a line to be afraid of at all, especially this move f5. I think actually knight to f6 is probably a better bet when we're trying to equalize. But then knight c3 transposes to the, what's called Petrosian Queen's Indian, and I guess this is part of your repertoire. So, guessing I would go for a3, and in the move order you gave, I would go for knight f3, b6, e4, or on a quiet day, maybe I would go knight f3, b6, g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, c5, whatever, castles, and then, depending on circumstances, probably play with c4. So those are the options I can see. Generally, this 4f5, nothing to be too concerned about, in my opinion. Mr. Old Bum. Next in line, we have DANVSG. He's saying, "Hi sir, can you suggest something against the Scotch game and Scotch Gambit for black? Thanks in advance." That's a big topic, so I'm not sure we can do it full justice in the time we have. But it's actually a topic that I've been working on a bit because I should do some video series for Chess24 that covers, once again, the good old topic, sidelines after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Main reason to do this is because we just published this series on the Berlin by Laurent Fressinet, and I promised him I would fill the gaps, like the 4 knights here, knight to c3, and knight c3, knight f6, and so on and so forth. So I will probably try to expand that into also giving some stuff against the Scotch and the Scotch Gambit and all that good stuff. Anyway, let's give the short version of my beliefs. The Scotch is d4, ed, knight takes d4. I've always been a fan of the move knight to f6. Feels like the most direct and most challenging move for white. Now knight c3 leads to this 4 knights, which is very boring, but nothing to be afraid of after bishop b4. So the lines you want to know are after knight c6, bc, e5. Black plays queen e7, white plays queen e2, black plays knight t5. Here there are some options, but the main move is pawn to c4, when I've always liked bishop to a6, pinning. Nothing wrong as far as I know with the alternative knight to b6 either. But I always like this. After b3 I like the line with g6, and if white goes knight d2, this is what I consider the most challenging line within the Scotch. Then black has a choice to make between f6, g6 and long castles. All three of these moves I think are okay. I haven't really made up my mind yet which one I want to recommend. In the video series, in the past I've played g6, which is also the main line and the move people will be expecting. The knight f3, queen b4, we get this very strange position. But I might change my mind for the video series and go with a move like f6, which as far as I can tell also looks very, very playable. So that is the very short version of the Scotch. There's some other weirdo lines like h4 or g3 and whatnot, but nothing to be too afraid of. While the Scotch Gambit, I guess, yeah, I think this is it. Starts with bishop to c4 here, d4, ed, bishop c4. Here, for practical reasons, I normally have not played knight f6, which is fine as far as I know. The best move after knight f6 is e5, and now pawn to d5, or knight to g4, but especially pawn to d5. I think has a pretty decent reputation. Bishop b5, knight e4, or knight d7 takes, bishop d7 or bishop c5. There's quite some theory around this, but as far as I know, everything's fine for black. And castle's knight takes e4 has been known to be fine for black for probably literally centuries. Rook e1, d5, takes, knight to c3, and here, pick a square. I like queen h5, I think queen d7 or queen d8 also do equalize. So, long speech on what I normally don't do. What I normally do for laziness reasons is I play bishop to c5. Defending the pawn, Scotch Gambit players will blitz out c3, hoping for d takes c, bishop takes f7 check. That's the big trick. King f7, queen d5 check. But if we don't fall for that and go knight to f6, we now have magically transposed to a line that I covered quite a bit in my video series on the Italian, which you would reach via that move order there. And this position is fine for black. cd, bishop b4, I admit, is not the most interesting thing in the world, but black is perfectly fine. Takes. While the more is e5, when black once again goes d5, and you can find details about bishop b5 or bishop e2 in my video series on Chess24. Long story short, black goes here and he's okay. So there was, a very brief repertoire or overview against the Scotch and Scotch Gambit. I've never been too afraid of the Scotch, but black has to do some work because these resulting positions are somewhat non-standard and can be tough to handle. Computers really like black, which makes it easier to navigate your way through them with a good feel. And while the Scotch Gambit, you can pick one of the lines I mentioned, they both equalize. Thanks for your question, Mr. DANVSG. Then we have willgivejanpawns. He is saying, Dear Jan, I am looking to build up a small store of nonsense lines where I can give up a pawn, or preferably multiple pawns, in return for a vague promise of development or an attack. This part is optional. Alright. First of all, I would like to thank you for living up to your username. We've played some Banter Blitz games and you have consistently given me pawns. So I do appreciate that. I do like pawns. He's asking, could you give any comments on A, d4, d6, e4, knight f6, knight c3, c5? Yeah, that looks like junk, but it will probably accomplish your goal of giving pawns away. takes c. My best guess is you're not interested in d takes c5. One line that black should not play. That somehow, sometimes randomly, I'm not sure if you guys have this or I have it because I'm a crazy person, but sometimes very random chess positions pop into my head. And this 3c5 takes queen a5, c takes d6, knight takes e4, queen d4, and white wins is a line that shows up in my head for no reason. Once in a while. I don't think it will ever happen, but don't stop believing. So for your purposes, I'm guessing you will want to move like knight to c6, c takes d, and I don't know, how would you play it? g6? Looks a bit dodgy, but you're giving up some pawns for maybe vague hope of development. So that's good. But I don't think it's too enjoyable a line. I have a question, by the way. After d4, why not just go e5? d, e, knight c6, knight f3, d6. You've given up a pawn very cleanly. If e, d, bishop d6, you have a very clear plan of attack. Bishop g4, queen e7, long castles, knight f6, h5. And what's not to like? Probably bishop g5 is not that much to like. But still, you're a pawn down, you can play f6 or queen d7. And life goes on. So, why do we need all this sophistication when you can just play the hard rock gambit d4, e5, d, knight c6, followed by d6? We cut out all this nonsense. Still, let's look at what other lines were on that list. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4. That's oddly specific. Sorry, d4, knight f6, bishop b5 check, knight bd7, bishop d7. You know what? We don't need an engine to look at these things. Engines won't make this better. Bishop takes, knight takes, e5. Is this some weird theory that only willgivejanpawns knows about? ed, queen a5 check. Bishop d2, queen a6. I'm assuming queen a5 check, queen a6 is the idea. Looks like you're pawn down for not very much. So, mission accomplished. Knight c3. White should consolidate, but it does seem to suit your goals fairly well, even though I'm not sure if anybody would play this exact sequence of bishop b5 check. And so on and so forth. Maybe they do, I do not know. Last and hopefully least, or C, anyway, to semi-productively give up black's c5 pawn in the Benko. That's gonna be tough to do, no? It's not even under attack. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5. C takes b, a6. How would we get rid of this pawn? Like you really need white to play along, like attack it by queen c2, then you can give it up. But that's not going to happen very often. But I do have one Benko line for you that maybe is too good for the goals we have in mind here, but it should suit your style. So b takes a6, you don't recapture, you go e6, knight c3, takes, bishop e7. You're currently 2 pawns down. And you have a vague promise of elite in development. Castles, knight c6, knight d5. Eventually you can recapture this pawn. This is not even a bad line, Dubov, and serious players have played it, so it should be right up your alley. Unless it's too good. That's the best I can see in the Benko complex. Getting rid of the c5 pawn. It's gonna be very tough. Like, okay, I'm sure you can find a way to lose it, but it does not look that productive. So I hope I have helped you to give away some more of your pawns, Mr. willgivejanpawns, and best of luck on your noble mission. Let's answer one more question by Monsieur Assassin in White, and he wants to talk about the position after knight to f3, d5, d4, bishop to f5. Hello Jan, what's your opinion about the line knight 3, d5, d4, bishop f5? Kind of a reverse London, how sound it is, and what are the most critical lines? I see it as a way to avoid Catalan and anti-Queen's Indian with knight f3, c4, g3. Is it practical to play as black, or are there other moves or movers if we want to play Queen's Indian defense after knight f3, but don't want to play the headshot double fianchetto? Thanks and have a nice cup of coffee. Thank you. Do I have coffee? I keep forgetting my coffee these days. Let me check. Empty. Not completely empty. It's kind of cold by now. But thanks for the reminder, assassin in white. So, knight f3, d5, d4, bishop f5. It's one of these lines that, yeah, weren't really on anybody's radar. I think even a couple of years ago, I just thought what was better after c4, e6, knight c3. But things have changed a bit, because they used to play c6 here, queen b3, queen b6, c5. And this is indeed better for white, queen c7, bishop f4. Or queen takes b3, ab, very nice endgame. But instead of c6, people start playing different moves here. The biggest proponent of this line is probably Jan Gustafsson, who plays this almost exclusively, as far as I can see, against one knight f3 these days, and he likes to move knight to f6 here. His reasoning for playing this is very different from yours. Gustafsson is a Grunfeld player, so he's willing, against the Grunfeld, to play, against one d4, to play this stuff. But against one knight f3, I guess he's less happy about the common ways to try to reach the Grunfeld like this, where white has all these sidelines like h4, g3, queen somewhere, and so on and so forth. So he wants to combine the Grunfeld with knight f3, d5, d4, bishop f5. Yeah, that's how he gets here. I don't know how good it is. I haven't spent enough time to give a well thought out opinion, but obviously if Gustafsson is willing to play this every game against the best players in the world, it can't be completely ridiculous. It seems to me like with standard development you can't do that much damage to black, because black's setup is sound at its core. If he manages to get c6, knight bd7 without being bothered, then yeah, you get your sort of London setup, and it should be equal if there is no immediate pressure to be put on it. So let's say bishop g5, c6, e3, knight b7. Obviously white is fine, but so should black. So should black be. So to my mind the most critical here is the move knight to h4. Recurring theme today, knight h4 challenging this bishop on f5. When, once again, I'm curious what Gustafsson wants to do. He's started playing bishop g6 here, but I think in recent games, maybe because of queen b3, I'm not sure, he has stopped going for this bishop g6 move and instead replaced it with bishop to b4, which is a very ambitious strategic concept. I believe also once played by Peter Svidler against Guzman. So it's an interesting line. It's of course quite risky positionally. We give up the two bishops. We have double pawns, but this pawn on f5, as is known from many, a Slav line, does a very decent job, or an Nimzo line, controlling the e4 square. And this position is by no means clear and could be a decent way to get an unbalanced position against maybe lower rated opponents if you want to complicate the game as much as possible. To my mind, something like this should still be the critical try here. Bishop g5, to my surprise, hasn't really been played, which looks very logical. I wasn't sure what black wants to do here. I guess d takes c and e3, and I'd take white, but it's strategically complex. But yeah, I believe if you want to play knight f6 here, then this knight h4 is the move to deal with. There's also the move knight to c6, which is very ugly to my classically trained eyes. You're blocking your own c-pawn, but it's not easily refuted either, and it's not even obvious how white should get an edge here. Maybe the best is to just play this small move like a3, taking away all shenanigans based on bishop b4 or knight to b4, because the direct lines like cd, ed, bishop f4 seems like black is reasonably solid. Bishop d6 seemed to work tactically, and I could not find anything too great And once again, the same logic. If black eventually consolidates in this cardspot structure with his bishop out, things can be quite okay for him. So long story short, I don't think this line is stupid. And yeah, the questions to answer would be knight f6, knight h4. What do you want to do? Or do you have the heart to play knight c6, which I still can't make friends with, but I could not refute either. It does seem extreme to me to do this because you want to avoid whatever, the double fianchetto or the head shock. Because especially the double fianchetto, if you're a Queen's Indian player by trade, looks like a very healthy addition to your repertoire. That's not that much theory to learn. The same can be said about e6 here. So those still strike me as more natural choices via one move or another. But if you don't like them, knight f3, d5, d4, bishop f5. Does seem like a pretty sensible way to get away from mainstream theory without getting too bad a position. So yeah, not fully against it, even though your reasoning I'm surprised by. Thanks for the question, Mr. Assassin in White, and thanks everybody who asked stuff in today's show. I hope we all learned at least a little something, and see you in, I believe, episode 4 is the next one, next week. Thanks for watching, bye.